As I mentioned at the end of the last mini lecture, there were very different reactions to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. And the Republicans had an interesting battle in the late 1960s for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. And two men, ironically, both Californians, became real rivals for who was going to lead this attack on the Great Society. One man was named Richard Nixon, and the other Ronald Reagan. I personally, if I had to choose one of the two conservative reactions, I think that Richard Nixon's was better planned, better thought out, and was a more reasonable middle ground than Reagan's personally. But let me go through both of these conservative reactions in this mini lecture. So if we take a look at the first, Richard Nixon. Nixon was president from 1969 to 1974. The name for Richard Nixon's federalism was called the New Federalism. And it's really interesting that, as I've told you before, sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows. And look in your notes. Both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton took a managerial view of federalism, and you should underline that, star that. You're likely to see that on the exam. Both Nixon and Clinton took a managerial view of federalism with the goal of trying to make federalism more efficient. So both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton understood that the national government had the deep pockets, they had the money, they were the ones who were going to have to provide the revenue in cooperative federalism. But both of them believed that federalism could be more efficient, that there was significant waste and inefficiency. And certainly, if you take a look at Bill Clinton's welfare reform program, the goal was to make the welfare program more efficient. Now, whether or not welfare reform was oversold, which I believe that it was, the goal, they both wanted to reduce the complexity of intergovernmental relations. They wanted to give maximum flexibility to state and local decision makers who were implementing these programs. So Richard Nixon, a Republican, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and yet both of them took a approach to federalism that very, very closely mirrored one another. So what should you know for exam purposes other than Nixon took a managerial view? He wanted to reduce the complexity of intergovernmental relations. Well, he did this. Take a look. It's in your notes. Nixon wanted to return programs and tax dollars to state and local control with maximum flexibility in spending. So Nixon understood that we, the federal government, are going to finance these programs, but we also do not believe the best way to implement them are one-size-fits-all programs from Washington, D.C. So we're going to allow decision makers at the state and local levels to have more flexibility in terms of how to spend this money, to target their programs to the specific needs of their community. To accomplish this goal, Nixon advocated block grants, put some stars or circle block grants. Block grants are grants that target broad policy areas, and I gave you an example earlier. Let's make up a block grant, community health. You can see it's a broad policy area. There are a lot of things that constitute community health. It could be nutrition, it could be immunizations, it could be examinations and screenings, it could be a variety of things. And keep in mind the example that I gave you last time. Maybe in a younger community like Stanislaus and Merced counties, we are targeting young children and infants and expected mothers. But in Florida, those same dollars could go to the needs of the elderly. So block grants have significant flexibility in those programs. Even broader than block grants are general revenue sharing. And as you read chapter 3, you'll notice under Reagan this term general purpose grant. General revenue sharing was changed, the name was changed to general purpose grant during the Reagan administration, but it's the same idea. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a whole lot. General revenue sharing is, in essence, getting a blank check from the national government. Obviously, you can't do whatever you want with the money. You have to have open and competitive bidding. You have to have fair contracting. You can't discriminate, and a variety of others. But general revenue sharing is the type of grant that has the absolute maximum flexibility. So if you want to summarize Nixon, he's a manager. He's trying to make federalism more efficient. He recognizes that the national government has the deep pockets and has to finance this, but he wants to add flexibility to federalism by allowing state and local decision makers more options in decision makings, more flexibility in deciding how the problems of their community should be solved. Now, contrast this with the second conservative, Ronald Reagan. Like Nixon, Reagan wants to return programs to state and local control, but he wants them to assume more of the cost. And one of the reasons is that during the Reagan administration, for the first time, we start seeing very large budget deficits. And so Reagan is looking for places to cut costs. And one of the places that he believes that he can cut costs is in the arena of federalism. Your book and most books that I've used say that this is the beginning of really large-scale unfunded mandates. And what an unfunded mandate is the national government tells a state or a city or a county that we are mandating that you do something, but we are not going to finance it. So we're going to demand that you do this, but we're not going to give you the funds to do that. One critic of Ronald Reagan's was a woman at Penn State University. Her name was Susan Welch. And Professor Welch in her book referred to Ronald Reagan's program of unfunded mandates as morning after federalism, right? Think about the mental image of morning after federalism, right? Morning after getting screwed, right? In this particular case, the national government's taking away money from state and local programs and yet demanding that state and local governments be responsive and have these programs for the people in their community. What you should really know about Reagan, besides the fact that he wanted state and local governments to assume more of the cost, that's one thing you should know. But the other thing that you should know is that Reagan advocated categorical grants. These are grants that have minimal flexibility. These are programs that have the most regulations, or what most experts would call strings attached. The last year that I have a definitive figure for is 2014, where nearly 90%, I think it was 89.4%, of all federal grant money is categorical. During the Nixon years, almost 40% of grant money was either block or general revenue sharing. Today it's less than 10%. So to me, the two big changes in federalism during the Reagan years are the fact that we have a lot of the flexibility taken out of the system by categorical funding. And that to me is really the big change during the Reagan years. But also this notion that he wanted state and local governments to assume more of the costs. Now, in the 5 minutes that I have left in this particular mini lecture, I want you to follow along and take a look. Well, what's happened over the last 30 years? Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, and what has happened? The first one, and I would put some stars, here, there has been an explosion of grant money. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, the national government was transferring about $109 billion a year to state and local governments. In 2018, it was $728 billion. In 2019, it was $749 billion. And I have not seen a figure for 2020, but I saw one estimate saying that it might be as high as $800 billion. I don't know. I haven't confirmed that figure. But the point is that steadily grant money has been increasing. Sounds like a great thing. The national government is giving a lot of money to state and local governments, but of course there's a cost for that. Federal grants today are about 1/3 of total state funding. More than 50% of state funding for health care and public assistance comes from federal grants, and of course, that gives the national government tremendous power or leverage. It essentially means that in many cases, when the national government says jump, the state and local response is how high, because they really cannot oppose the national government in many cases because they're so dependent on that money. Now, if you take a look at grants, I have listed the 4 largest grant programs that go to state and local governments. And when I ask you on the exam, what is the largest grant program, there's not even a close second. Take a look at the figure in your notes. The largest grant program in 2018 was Medicaid, with a budget of $433 billion a year. The second largest program are highways, with only $43 billion. So Medicaid is 10 times larger than the second largest federal grant program, which are highways. Notice that third are childhood nutrition programs at $24 billion and disaster relief at $20 billion. So those are kind of the big 4, and there obviously are a lot of other programs. So the first big innovation over the last 30 years is that the amount of federal grant money has exploded. Second, there have been very specific innovations depending on who the president is. Under Bill Clinton, it was No Child Left Behind. Under our welfare reform under Clinton, No Child Left Behind, or I call it Every Child Left Behind under George W. Bush. The Affordable Care Act under Barack Obama. So certainly there are presidents that have a specific legacy, and certainly that would be 3 examples. But the one that I want you to star is the biggest surprise in my teaching of American government. Star the return of the 10th Amendment. When I was in college and taking constitutional law, my professor said that if you want to understand the history of the Constitution, you need to understand the 10th Amendment. At one time it was important, but during the Great Depression it died, and it'll probably never make a comeback. Well, in 1995, something surprising happened. In a case called U.S. versus Lopez, we have a situation where we have a battle between the state of Texas and the U.S. government over who gets to regulate handguns near school sites. The U.S. government made the claim that handguns are easily bought, they're easily sold, they're easily transported across state lines. They're agents of interstate commerce, they have the right to regulate it. And Texas claimed that in this particular case, they had the right to regulate handguns. And I have to admit, I told all of my classes that, in every case since 1937, the U.S. government has won these battles when you've had Article 1, Section 8 versus the 10th Amendment. Put lots of stars here. You will see this. In the case of U.S. versus Lopez, the Supreme Court limited, and put like 5 underlines under limited Congress's use of the Commerce Clause for the first time since the Great Depression. It was shocking to me that the states actually won a states' rights argument using the 10th Amendment. Don't misinterpret this. The states have won a handful of battles over the last 25 years. The U.S. government still usually wins. In the vast majority of cases, they win. But this case illustrated the 10th Amendment could be used and listened to by the Supreme Court.